What would you do if a potential customer, perhaps an inventor, approached your shop wanting to buy out your entire capacity for a set amount of time? And then what would you do if they said they also wanted to work on the floor with you while that happened? What's up, guys? Ian Sandusky from Lakewood Machine and Tool back here again for Practical Machinist. And on this episode of Machine Shop Talk, we're going to be diving into the Practical Machinist forums to help tackle a question posed by a member that came on with exactly this scenario. But before we do, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications below to make sure you never miss a video. Let's get into it. Okay guys, so as promised, today we are going to be diving back into the Practical Machinist forums to tackle the question we posed at the top of this episode. So to cover the basics of the post, a Practical Machinist forums member came onto the shop management and ownership subforum with a bit of predicament on his hands, as these people tend to come onto these forums with. So to cover it very briefly, as I understand it, the person who came on to post seems to own a small machine shop. I could be wrong here, but this was my interpretation of it. That was kind of the way it came off. So if I'm wrong right off the bat, I apologize. But what's happened is recently they were approached by an individual which they described off the bat as an inventor. And this is a person described as a PhD level, smart person with manufacturing adjacent experience. And what the deal that they want to make is they have some prototypes that they want to get made that they want the shop to do. But, and there's always a but, this part that's being made isn't just a prototype where they can give them a drawing, you make it, you give me the part, the way job shop stuff typically works. It sounds like this prototype has some troubleshooting, it has some processes that need to get figured out. So this inventor actually wants to not only rent out the entire shop's capacity for a set amount of time, but they actually want to work on the floor with the machine shop while it's being done so they can figure out what they need to do. This poster actually sounded fairly interested in this scenario, which I found a little bit surprising. I didn't expect this to be a talk me into this scenario. It kind of was a talk me out of this scenario, which I found surprising. But the responses on the forum to the questions they were asking were actually a lot more varied than I thought they would be. Essentially, this person was coming on asking, has anybody had this kind of arrangement happen before? What is your experience been? What are some things I should watch out for? And I thought, once I read the first post, their original post on there, that all the responses were going to be in one direction, and that would be a negative direction, because as we'll get into, this scenario has happened to a lot of people and very rarely do come away feeling good. That said, there were a lot of good responses there from people that had successfully navigated this kind of scenario, which was really, really interesting. So we do link the thread below here. I recommend checking it out because there's a lot of good information we're just not going to get a good chance to cover in this episode. The reason I was surprised by this is because that initial post raised a few really high red flags for me, just in my experience and what I've learned over the years and the kind of scenarios I've been involved with. And the first thing that raised a red flag to me was the term inventor. Here's the thing. Anybody who's worked in a public-facing shop, so in other words, there's guys that may walk in off the street, has probably dealt with somebody who is claiming or is an inventor. In my experience, and in the quite vocal experience of some of the posters on there, this should ring an alarm bell right away. And when I say ring an alarm bell, again, as we kind of talk about in these videos, that doesn't mean no, run away, make sure you never do it. It means it should ring an alarm bell that you should do some more homework here before saying yes. To put it bluntly, there are a lot of incredible inventors out there, people developing products, trying to help the world and make some money while doing it, or they have a good idea that they just need some help getting off the ground. Maybe they have a concept they need to work out, but they're not a machinist, so they need somebody to make that part. Think of some of the biggest companies in the world. Realistically, those were started by inventors. So this is not to dog on inventors at all. That said, there are a lot of people that fall under the inventor umbrella who will be an absolute headache to deal with if you're a shop that is currently trying to turn a profit. The real issue is that inventors typically don't have very large budgets. Usually they are idea people, or they are concept people that have an idea that they are trying to get a prototype or a first off done for as cheaply as possible to prove their concept so they can go sell it and then make lots of money. But at the time, their budget's going to be fairly constrained. And that means you're going to be fighting those budget constraints right out of the gate. And we've talked about this before, that can be a real nightmare. The second thing is that in my personal experience, and echoing some of what I saw in that thread, the intellectual property aspect, sorry, there's a lot of this in this episode because a lot of buzzwords, but the intellectual property aspect of dealing with an inventor can make things difficult. And I get it, when it comes to inventing a new concept or a new process or anything like that, your intellectual property in this scenario may be all you have. It may be the only thing you have. So it makes sense to really do the work in advance to protect that idea and make sure that you are being diligent, that you're not just giving an idea out that someone else may make a ton of money on. I get that whole thought process. With that said, usually you should protect those things with something like an NDA, and NDA, non-disclosure agreement. So basically both parties sign it. It says, typically it's a one-page document, and it says something along the lines of 1 to 2 pages. We can't talk about anything shared here. If I disclose this stuff, I am liable, yada, yada, yada. You sign, away you go. Fairly simple terms usually. The other thing that this poster said about this individual who approached them is that they had sent along something like I'm making this up, but a 30-page NDA. I don't know if it was 30 pages, but it was big. And it was all this convoluted legalese, to the point where the person coming on to ask this question was having a difficult time even figuring out what this NDA was saying. And that is a huge red flag in itself. Some of the most, I guess I'll call it conspiracy-minded NDAs I've ever seen in my life have come from this class of potential customer. And that's because, you're dealing with individuals who are dealing with intellectual property, and like the normal run of people out there, you have people who are paranoid, and you have people who understand the way things work in a manufacturing industry where, idea in most cases isn't really worth much. When you get the more paranoid people, you may get 40 pages of legalese saying, if I even breathe about this in my sleep, I'm gonna get sued and I'm not gonna, whatever. It can be a big thing to deal with. And it's important to keep in mind that even someone who's paranoid and has these crazy NDAs, you gotta remember they're people, they're probably just trying to do their best. As other people said in the responses to this, a good litmus test, if you have one of these across your desk in this kind of scenario, is to look at that 30-page NDA. Don't disregard it, but typically you can find a 2-page NDA online or a 1-page NDA online that's fairly stock. Modify it, send it to them and say, hey, listen, this is kind of typically the more normal NDA that we sign. Do you mind signing this just to start? If they say yes, or maybe, hey, listen, I just want to add in 2 things here, it means you're probably dealing with someone who's reasonable, someone who's going to be a little bit less of a headache. If they say, no, I want the 40-page NDA before you can even know what we're doing, I'm not saying that that's a bad idea, because some huge companies that you'll deal with will have 40-page NDAs. It's a fact. If you're dealing with an individual with that same thing, maybe they're just coming from that world and they're used to that, but it would make me question a little bit more what I'm doing here and whether I want to get involved with it. Secondly, my hackles got raised when I heard that they physically want to be there on the floor while the manufacturing takes place, while the machines are running, while things are getting programmed. That was a big, big, big red flag for me. As others pointed out, this comes with a few issues. The first one to point out is a matter of practicality, and that's every business's favorite thing, insurance. What happens if someone gets hurt? Who is liable? Plain and simple. Again, as we always say, we like to think we're dealing with normal thinking people who are, not going to be litigious and try to destroy your business if something bad happens. But if you have someone on your floor who does not work for you and may not be covered by your insurance, all it could take is one bad day or even one bad minute to change their life for the worse forever. And if that happens, I don't know if you can really fault them for potentially going after you legally for something like negligence or not adhering to safety protocols. And even if you were doing everything right and they still go after you for this, now you are going to be tied up in a legal battle. It's something very practical to think about. You know, I know we don't like talking about things like liability and stuff because it feels kind of gross and too businessy and corporate, but it's something you need to keep in mind every day when you're running a shop. If you are not being responsible for your liability and trying to make sure people are working safely, you're gonna have a very bad time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the matter of them physically standing there while you work. It reminds me of, there used to be a toolbox sticker I used to see around a lot in small shops. And it used to say something, I don't see it so much anymore, but I still see it, but it's a sticker that says, shop rate. Normal shop rate, $50 an hour. Shop rate if you watch, $100 an hour. Shop rate if you watch and make suggestions, $200 an hour. Shop rate if you watch, or sorry, shop rate, how did it go? Shop rate if you could have done it yourself, but you just didn't have the machine, $500 an hour. It sounds kind of funny and boomerish. You know, it's one of those things you'd expect to see in the 70s on the old timers box, but there is a very big kernel of truth there. When it comes to having someone work alongside you or watch, you know, the guy who comes in and wants to watch you work and make a suggestion, it's gonna slow down your work process, if not halt it entirely every time it happens. When a customer comes to you with a job, they're not just coming to you because, whether they know it or not, they're not just coming to you because you have machines or that you have staff. They're also coming to you for your expertise, your judgment, you know, all the work you've done in the field. That is the other half of what they're buying. Think of it this way. If a customer wants to watch, give feedback and all that stuff, every time they do that, that job is going to take longer because you are going to have to justify it. Let's say you, in this scenario, you quote out a job to be run on the lathe. So someone comes in and says, I want to watch, and you say, cool, I'm gonna run this on the lathe. It's gonna cost X amount of dollars. Cool. So you now go over to your lathe and you're starting to set it up and you think to yourself, do you know what? This is gonna be way faster on the mill. Well, now that customer that is watching you may say, what are you doing setting this up in a mill? That's not what I paid for. You know, that's not gonna be as accurate. That's not gonna be as whatever, rightly or wrongly. When really it could be faster, more accurate, and take less time than doing it on the lathe. You now need to justify it to someone who is breathing down your neck. And the entire time you're justifying it, you're wasting time. And at the end of the day, they still may not be happy because people are people and say, well, I paid to have it turned on a lathe and he did it on a mill and I watched and I paid the same amount, but I'll never go back. And now you got someone out there running their mouth about your shop for whatever reason. In a situation like this, if you have someone on the floor with you constantly and you're making their parts, you may find yourself in a scenario where you need to justify every single choice you make on the job as it happens. It's like being micromanaged. That's pretty much what it is. And every time that happens, you're going to waste time. And every time a suggestion is made and you need to convince them that no, the reason you're doing it this way, you're wasting time. And that job that should take an hour and a half now takes 2 days. I've seen it, I've been there, I've made this mistake before. I saw a few good suggestions on there from people that were really, really helpful to help navigate this kind of scenario. And the first one was to approach the inventor before this whole scenario starts and say, listen, we don't necessarily want you on the floor, but what we can do is we can have a meeting, a manufacturing meeting, either for an hour a day at the beginning of the day or end of the day, every single day. So before things get started or after things end, we will meet for an hour with a hard stop, review what we did, and plan for the next day. That would be billed at shop rate because, you know, listen, meetings aren't free if we're not getting productivity. I would bill it at the same shop rate, but that way it keeps them off the floor during machining hours, but also gives them a chance to modify, give feedback as you go without impacting the work being done. That's one suggestion. I thought that was a good one. The second one was if the inventor wants to be able to walk on the floor, giving them an option to do that, but having a tools down policy. So what that would mean is, listen, the inventor can walk on the floor anytime they want, look what's going on, make suggestions. But when that happens, the machine is feed holded, all tools go down, and we're gonna talk. And we will continue to bill at shop rate the entire time we're talking and making suggestions. That's good because again, you're still getting paid for what you're doing. And listen, somebody on there put it very, very succinctly, and I thought this was hilarious, that most machinists and machine shop owners, if a customer wants me to come to their shop and pay me my shop rate to pet their dog for 4 hours, I'll do it. Why not? You know, if they're paying for it, it doesn't really matter. It's all kind of built into there. What you're trying to avoid is a scenario where you're not getting paid, although you're still doing work because the customer doesn't think you're physically machining and therefore they don't need to pay. The last thing to consider in this scenario, of course, was the payment terms. And the original poster and another person who worked there came on and they actually had a very good payment term system they were proposing for this, and I agree with it. I thought it was great. So what they proposed, and this is a fantastic idea. Well, sorry, let's back up for a second. The fear in these scenarios is that, especially with a job that does not have a set endpoint, so we're not making a prototype, we're trying to develop a prototype. The fear is that the scope of work starts here and then it ends up ballooning to here, and then the customer either doesn't want to or can't pay for all that added cost because the job blew up. And that happens, and it's bad. So the solution that the original poster put forth, which I thought was great, was to first of all have a very tightly worded scope of work. So essentially on the quote, they would put out, listen, we are allotting this many hours per week for you. These are the objectives we're going to accomplish. Anything outside of this is not covered. You know, listen, we're allotting for this much material. We're allotting for this much machine time. We're allotting for this much programming. Essentially very tightly constraining the scope of work right off the bat. Getting both people to sign it so that therefore if there are any overruns to that, that is also compensated. The second thing I thought was really good is instead of trying to bill the person afterwards, because this is it's a scenario that can be great, but it's a scenario that can have some pitfalls, is they said, so once we have that constraint of work, what we're gonna do is we're gonna estimate the hours we have for the coming 2 weeks based on that constraint, bill them and prepay for 2 weeks of work. At the end of that 2 weeks, we do this again, constrain what work we're doing, bill for the next 2 weeks, do the next 2 weeks of work, and so on and so forth. I thought this was great because it gets the customer's skin in the game. You know they're not gonna walk on you, especially if this person is not a longtime customer. You know, we don't know who they are. That's very protective of the shop, but it's also very protective of the customer. I feel like that's not taking advantage of them. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first one is the customer also probably doesn't know you. So if they sign on for a 6-month contract, which probably nobody is happy with, what if after 3 weeks they realize, you know what, you are just not capable of producing what I need? Or maybe we don't get along. I want to come in and meet with you all the time and you and I we're two personalities that clash. It gives them an opportunity to say, do you know what, we did 2 weeks. We got this far, thank you very much, I'm gonna go elsewhere. It's a great thing for them. Conversely, it's also a very protective thing for the shop. Listen, what if after 2 weeks we realize we're quoting this thing out way too low? We need to adjust for the next 2 weeks. Had that been a 6-month contract, too bad, so sad, you're stuck. You know, when we talk a lot about in these videos about taking time to step back and really evaluate what you're doing frequently, this is doing that in advance. It's booking out time to evaluate the job as it goes, adjust. It keeps everybody agile and it keeps everybody honest. I think that is a fantastic thing to do. The last thing I'd like to point out in relation to this is the opportunity cost. As said, the person said, they want to book out my entire capacity. I'm not going to be able to take on any other work. This happens, it's not a bad scenario. It means you're going to have work for the next X amount of time. The problem is you're going to miss out on what's called opportunity cost. So during that time, let's say this is a 6-month contract, you know, by the time it's all done in 2-week increments, there are almost definitely going to be chances you would have to do other good paying work for potential good other customers that could turn into massive customers that you were gonna miss out on while doing this contract. You need to, when you're quoting this out and you're thinking about this kind of deal, make sure you are factoring in the opportunity cost, because it's not just about the work you're doing, it's about the work you're missing out on. So however you structure that deal, it's always worth, evaluating that and kind of building that into the quote to make sure that at the end of this job, when it's done, if they don't come back, maybe I have a cushion for a month to be able to find more work, based on the amount of money I made on that job. It's something you need to think about. At the end of all this, it did sound like the the person who came on was figuring out a good deal with this potential customer. They did say in later posts, maybe Inventor wasn't the best way to put this guy, or the right box to put this guy in. He's an academic, he's a brilliant guy, we get along well, and it sounds like they're gonna do it. So I do recommend you check out this thread. I found it very, very interesting, very insightful, because you don't see scenarios like this come up a lot, so it's always fun to read about kind of weird scenarios out there that you may stumble upon at some point. And in the comments below, I'd like to know if you've ever been through this kind of scenario. Has your shop done it? Would you do it again? Did you get burned? Did it turn out great? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications below to make sure you never miss a video. Thank you very much for watching, guys. You take care.